The nation mourns our 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush, as President Trump calls a temporary truce in the trade war with China at a summit of world leaders in Argentina.
We've made tremendous progress at the G20 with many nations.
We'll break down the summit and how the president dealt with challenges from China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia with two key senators, Republican Roy Blunt, a member of the GOP leadership, and Democrat Ben Cardin, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Then, remembering a war hero turned statesman.
I really believe it. I really believe there can be no definition of a successful life that does not include service to others.
We'll revisit some of our special moments with Bush 41.
Do you feel a tremendous sense of pride when you see not just your children, but your grandchildren carrying on the family tradition?
A total sense of pride and great happiness.
And we'll get reaction from former Vice President Dick Cheney, who served as his Secretary of Defense, and James Baker, who served as his Secretary of State. Together, only on Fox News Sunday. Plus, we'll ask our Sunday panel about the legacy of President Bush.
Made plenty of mistakes, got some things right. Bottom line, serve with honor.
All right now on Fox News Sunday. You are looking live at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Air Force One that carried our 40th president around the globe in pursuit of peace. And welcome to a special hour of Fox News Sunday from the 6th Annual Reagan National Defense Forum, a gathering of key figures in national security. It was here we learned of the death of former President Bush, who among his many roles served as Reagan's vice president. We'll spend much of this hour reflecting on Bush's accomplishments, including a joint interview with Dick Cheney and James Baker. But we begin with breaking news. President Trump has put the brakes on his trade dispute with Chinese President Xi. Let's bring in White House correspondent Kevin Corke live in Buenos Aires, where President Trump met with world leaders. Kevin.
Chris, by agreeing to effectively a 90-day ceasefire, President Trump and his Chinese counterpart sent a very strong message to a market-round world that the ongoing trade dispute between the world's two largest economies could soon be entering a new phase.
This is a very important meeting. A lot of people are looking forward to it. I know that President Xi and myself are looking forward to it.
For 2.5 hours, the world watched and waited. That's how long the high-stakes talks between President Trump and his Chinese counterpart lasted here at the G20 summit in Argentina, a working dinner that proved long on promise but somewhat short on specifics. We did learn that the Americans agreed to leave tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports at 10% at the beginning of the new year, agreeing not to raise them to 25% as previously threatened. In return, China agreed to buy a substantial but unspecified amount of agricultural, energy, industrial, and other products from the U.S. to reduce its trade imbalance. Both countries agreed they'll try to have this transaction completed within the next 90 days. If it doesn't happen, the Americans insist the 10% tariffs will be raised to 25%. Meanwhile, after avoiding any public interaction with Russian President Vladimir Putin for much of the summit, the White House confirmed that President Trump did in fact have an informal conversation with the Russian leader, speaking at a cultural event here that, not coincidentally, was closed to reporters. Bit of housekeeping here for you, Chris. We also learned from the president that his next meeting with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, will likely take place in early 2019, January or February, according to the president, who also told us he would strongly consider a 2-week extension to avoid a government shutdown, a funding extension, that is, as the nation mourns the death of President Bush. Chris?
Kevin Corke reporting from Buenos Aires. Kevin, thanks for that. Joining us now with reaction to the meeting with President Xi is one of the Senate's Republican leaders, Roy Blunt. Senator, as Kevin just reported, President Trump has agreed to pause any increase in tariffs or any new tariffs for 90 days while we negotiate with the Chinese about trade issues, trade architecture, issues like trade technology, and also about their buying more U.S. goods. But isn't that the kind of vague, non-specific offer from the Chinese that the Trump administration has rejected in the past?
Chris, first let me join all the Americans who are expressing such gratitude for President Bush and his life and his great example. But on this topic, people like me who've really been concerned about the president's stated trade policy can take some encouragement about what happened in the last couple of days. The signing of the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement, that's a big step that 6 months ago or even just a few weeks ago we were concerned we would not be making that kind of progress. And on the Chinese front, you're exactly right, but we need more specifics here. The ag products that come from my state, that come from the middle of the country. I think the soybean exports to China have gone to virtually zero. From about 1 out of every 3 rows of Missouri soybeans were being exported to China. So whether it's those kinds of crops or pork or beef or chicken, we need to see some real specific figures here. This has hurt a lot of Missouri farm families and farm families all over the country. But the president's goal to get China in a better and fairer place in trade is the right goal. I'm just hoping that what we've seen in the Canada-Mexico side of the ledger is now going to have the same kind of impact as we're negotiating seriously with China.
Do you worry, and you kind of indicate you do, about the impact that the president's trade wars around the world, but especially with China, are having on the economy? We see the stock market jumping up and down. GM announced layoffs this week, that it's going to close 5 plants and lay off 15,000 workers. Do you worry that the president's trade policy is playing a role in all of that?
Well, I am concerned about it, and the president knows that. He's been very open to talking with me about it, but I think it's hard to win a trade war, and I also think though that the facts on the table with China are stronger than any other country in terms of our legitimate concerns. And the more other things that the president can move off the table, whether it's Canada, Mexico, the EU, Japan, the more of those things he can move off the table, the more flexibility he has with China. But I'd like to see China become the market that they should be for us. But I also like to see China create the opportunities for American companies that invest there to do things besides just steal our intellectual property and violate the agreements that China has clearly made and doesn't stand up to.
Senator, President Trump also canceled his meeting with Vladimir Putin at the G20. He said because of Russian aggression against Ukraine, but the Russians, a spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry suggested that the main reason, the real reason, may be because of President Trump's domestic political problems, including new revelations from the special counsel. 2 questions about that. Do you think that the special counsel's investigation has cast a cloud and made it more difficult for President Trump to do business on the world stage? And what do you think of the fact, because this is not the first time that Robert Mueller has announced some action just as the president was headed out on a foreign trip?
Well, you know, I haven't thought a lot about the Mueller timing here. I certainly do think that lying to the intelligence committee that I'm part of is a big mistake for whoever does it, and creates lots of problems for the committee itself. You know, when you lie to a congressional committee, when you lie to in an investigation where hundreds and thousands of man hours, people hours are being spent, the question you ask the next witness may be different. A witness you don't call may be somebody you would have called if you'd gotten the right answer. I'm glad to see the special prosecutor taking that particular crime seriously. But on the Russian front, I hope if the president did have any words to exchange with President Putin, it was outrage about what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. It is totally unacceptable. Right. The president, I think, announced that he wasn't going to have that meeting pretty quickly after what happened in Ukraine, as opposed to in response to anything else. And if the president had a chance to talk to President Putin, I hope his talk was very frank and no holds barred, that we are not going to accept the kind of activity that the Russians are looking at in Ukraine and Crimea, and right. To better send a strong message about the rest of Eastern Europe.
Senator Blunt, thank you. Thanks for coming in.
Great to be with you.
Always good to talk with you, sir. Joining us now, the #2 Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Ben Cardin. Senator, your reaction to the pause that has been announced in President Trump's trade war with China?
Well, Chris, first, it's good to be with you, and clearly it is encouraging to see that we are talking with the Chinese on the trade front. China has created many problems with trade. They have many obstacles to free trade. My concern about the president's trade policy is that his first action was to take tariffs against our closest allies based upon national security exceptions. We lost the unity that we needed in dealing with China. So now, as we go to a G20 meeting, the conversations take place between only two partners, where we would have been stronger if we had our closest allies working with us in regards to a China solution.
We talked with Senator Blunt about the GM layoff, and you know about that personally, because part of that layoff is the closing of a facility in Baltimore that employs more than 300 people. Do you think the president's trade policy and the imposition of tariffs, not just on China, but other countries around the world, has played a part in the GM layoffs, the added costs for steel and aluminum, and for a lot of the economic instability that we're seeing right now?
I do. I do think that the way the president has gone about the trade policies, imposing tariffs, there's a consequence. There's a domestic consequence. And clearly, General Motors' decisions are in part based upon the tariff issue. So, yes, it has an impact, and it costs us jobs here in America.
Let's turn to Russia, and you heard my discussion with Senator Blunt about the canceling of the meeting. Varied reasons given. The White House says it was because of Russian aggression in Ukraine. The Russians suggested maybe it was because of President Trump's problems with the special counsel. Do you worry at all that the special counsel is casting a cloud over this president and his ability to do business on the world stage? After all, Robert Mueller's been at this since May of 2017, and yes, there have been some guilty pleas, including from Michael Cohen this week, but there still is no solid evidence of any collusion between President Trump and the Russians.
Chris, I worry more about this president interfering with an independent investigation and what impact that has not only in America, but for the rule of law around the world. Mr. Mueller needs to be able to complete his investigation without interference. He's already had too much interference from the Trump White House. So I think that America, which stands for the rule of law, the leading democratic country in the world, our president needs to respect the independence of this investigation, and that's a clear message around the world. No, I don't think this investigation is affecting America's ability to deal with our problems around the world.
Finally, I got about a minute left. President Trump says that we still don't have solid evidence that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. First of all, do you think he's wrong? And secondly, even if you believe that MBS is responsible, how do we balance our outrage over this horrific act with the fact that it may be in our national security interest to continue to have an alliance with Saudi Arabia?
Chris, I sort of compare this to President Trump's denial of Mr. Putin's involvement in our 2016 elections, even though the evidence was very clear. There's no doubt in my mind that the Crown Prince understood what was happening in Turkey and was very much involved in that. We cannot allow that type of conduct to go unchallenged. Our strength, America and foreign policy, the values that we stand for, and what happened in Turkey just affects all of our core beliefs. The United States has to have a pretty strong position on it, and we have to demand that there be accountability. That does not mean we can't continue to have a strategic relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They need America. It's more important for that relationship from the Saudis' point of view, and we must make it clear that that can't go unchallenged.
Senator Cardin, thank you. Thanks for your time. Always good to talk with you, sir.
Thanks, Chris.
Up next, we'll have a live report on the plans to honor George H.W. Bush, and we'll take a look at some of his memorable moments right here on this program as Fox News Sunday continues from the Air Force One Pavilion at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Bush, like all presidents, approved as his final message to the country he loves so dearly. Rick.
Chris, George H.W. Bush was surrounded by a circle of family, friends, and clergy during his final hours here Friday night inside his home in this gated community. And his final words were to his son, George W., who told him on speakerphone he'd been a wonderful dad and he loved him. Bush 41 told his son, "I love you too." And he passed not long after. His body is now at a local funeral home. Tomorrow, the casket will be transported to Washington, D.C., thanks to a lift from the White House.
Most of you know the process, the procedure, but we'll be sending Air Force One, which is a special tribute that he deserves. He'll be missed. He'll be greatly missed. He's a terrific person, terrific man.
President Bush will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda for 38 hours until 7 a.m. Wednesday, declared a national day of mourning. Stock markets will be closed and Congress will hold off on votes, focusing instead on a funeral service at the National Cathedral, where President Trump and First Lady Melania are expected, along with former presidents and scores of other dignitaries and heads of state. Afterwards, George H.W. Bush will return home for a family funeral at St. Martin's Episcopal Church Thursday morning, and that afternoon he'll be buried in College Station, home to the Bush Library, alongside his wife Barbara and daughter Robin, who died of leukemia as a child. Today is expected to be quiet. Reserved for family and close friends. Chris?
Rick Leventhal reporting from Houston. Rick, thank you. I had the good fortune to sit down with George Bush twice after he left office. And I think our talks give you a real insight into why so many people who knew this president, including me, loved the man. The first time was at his Presidential Library and Museum at Texas A&M University. I asked the president where he got his strong commitment to public service.
Some of it was from my parents. I watched my father at an early age, not realizing what he was up to, doing a lot of charitable works. My mother hounded into us early on, do something for others. It's always been a part of my life, but I really believe it. I really believe there can be no definition of a successful life that does not include service to others.
Do you feel a tremendous sense of pride when you see not just your children, but your grandchildren carrying on the family tradition?
A total sense of pride and great happiness. I'm not trying to sit at the head table anymore. Chris, I've done that and I've enjoyed it and I've had a lot of challenges, but I take enormous pride in these grandkids, all of them, and watching them come along. The only thing about getting old is, you know, I just don't, I want to be around to
relationship between a father and son who are both presidents. You know, there's been a lot of pop psychology about you and 43, I'll call him, and your presence, and I know you hate these questions, but I'm going to ask, what's the relationship?
It's a new year. Here, shoot it.
What's the relationship?
Like any other father and son, that have a loving relationship. total confidence one in the other. I've tried to stay out of his way on the issues, but I'm in touch on the telephone. Yesterday evening we get home to Houston, telephone rings, it's the president. How's Mom? How are you doing, Dad? And be like any family. And that's important, I think, and especially in times of real difficulty for our country.
Do you think there's ever been, and I say this quite frankly, thinking of my father and me, ever been a sense of competition, him with you or you with him?
You hear it, but there isn't any. Such competition, and it burns me up a little bit to when the president first came in, I thought there's some people around him were trying trying to like, you got to establish your own persona. And all that. Well, he didn't have to establish anything. I've known who he was, and he's known. That we know that, but I don't think there's ever been any competition of that nature that I'm aware of, and I don't think he's ever felt it.
We also spoke about his son Jeb, who was then the former governor of Florida.
I'd like to see him run. I'd like to see him be president someday.
Really?
Or maybe senator, whatever. Yes, I would. I mean, right now it's probably a bad time because we've got enough bushes in there, but no, I would, and I think he's as qualified and as able as anyone. I know in the political scene. Now, you got to discount that. He's my son. He's my son. That I love.
Would you really want, after all you've gone through yourself and your son, to have another son go through the white?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He's my son that I love.
Would you really want, after all you've gone through yourself and your son, to have another son go through the white?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Technology. That's right. Free. Let me say, that's the kind of person George Bush was. There was a story early in his administration in 1989 to the effect generally that, well, the National Security Council's running foreign policy, the State Department's out of it, they're not doing. And I got a phone call from the president. He said, Bake, I want you and Susan to come up to Camp David with me this weekend. We did so, and there was never another story like that for the entire 4 years. That's the kind of person he was.
Secretary Baker, George Bush was not just your colleague, not just your boss. He was your dear friend for more than 60 years, and we have learned in the last few hours that you were with him when he passed away on Friday night. To the degree you feel comfortable doing it, can you share with us his last moments?
Yeah, he had a very gentle and peaceful passing, Chris. Only one of his children was living in Houston, Neil Bush. Neil and his wife Maria were there. My wife Susan and I, his rector from our church, St. Martin's Church in Houston, the doctors, some of the wonderful aides that took care of him in his later years, and it was a sweet situation. They made arrangements for all of his children to call in to in effect tell him goodbye. And his last words, the last words George Bush ever said were, "I love you," and he said those words to 43, President George Bush 43, who had called in to say, "Dad, I love you. I will see you on the other side," and President Bush said, "I love you," and those were his last words. Another tender moment about that, Chris, was that the Irish tenor Ronan Tynan was in town. He'd come to town just to pay a courtesy call on President Bush, and he happened to be there, and he sang a couple of songs for President Bush on that last evening. And he sang, one of them was Silent Night, and as he was singing, President Bush was mouthing the words of Silent Night. He had a very gentle and easy passing, the kind we ought to all hope we have.
Secretary Baker, Mr. Vice President, we want to thank you both so much. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss the legacy of President Bush. Oh, how he hated that word, and how much Washington has changed since he was in office. When we come back from the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California.
Regrets in the sense of not being able to communicate better, but I know if I'd have had the skills of Ronald Reagan, I probably would have had another 4 years, because he was so good.
Former President Bush discussing one of the big disappointments in his life, his failure to win re-election as president in 1992. And it's time now for our Sunday group. GOP strategist Karl Rove, incoming House Republican Conference Chair Liz Cheney, and columnist for The Hill, Juan Williams. Karl, I think it's fair to say that President Bush was a classic moderate Republican. He negotiated bipartisan compromises such as the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 1990, he negotiated a budget deal, which may have cost him his presidency because in order to cut the deficit, he broke his pledge, no new taxes. How different is the Washington of George Bush in terms of the idea of legislating, compromising from the Washington of today?
Well, I think it's somewhat different, but in that respect. But I think it's really different in the tone that he set. I mean, he was of that greatest generation, and there was a humility and a respect and a decency about him that sometimes is not seen frequently in Washington today. His best friend in Congress was Lud Ashley, a Democrat from Akron, Ohio. And he had friendships across the aisle based on, shared background, shared experiences in the time that they were together. And we don't see that much in Washington anymore.
You know, it's interesting, Liz, when I asked your dad the question about iron ass, I was a little nervous about it, but he gave such a great answer, and it was so revealing about President Bush because, yes, he expressed his opinion, but on the other hand, it wasn't personal, and he reached out and also made a show of sitting together with your dad at the Alfalfa Club dinner.
Well, let me just say that I am a proud member of Team Iron Ass, Chris. And, but President Bush, I was struck both by that story, but also by the piece where he was, talking about the soldier in Desert Storm. And I think that the emotion that he showed in terms of how proud he was and how moved he was of America and of our military. And I think that's something that really helps when you're talking about bipartisanship, is just getting back to remembering the fundamental goodness and greatness of somebody like George Bush, but also of our military, of our men and women in uniform. And that's something we all should remember and be able to come around. I want to get back, Juan, to the original question that I asked Carl. You and I had the great good fortune to cover Presidents Reagan and Bush back in the 80s. And to me now, it seems like a different world in terms of government's ability, the leaders in government of the various different factions, to come together, to compromise, and to solve our problems.
No question, Chris. We live in a polarized political age today, so divided. You know, the way I think of it, Chris, is sort of optimism versus pessimism. Mourning in America, a kinder, gentler America versus American carnage, as a message coming from the leader to the American people. So when I think of President Bush, I think of someone who crossed the aisle. You know, I was really taken by what Carl just said about his best friend being a Democrat, and while he served those 2 terms in Congress. And of course, he followed Reagan's pronouncement, 11th commandment, speak no evil of another Republican, versus Donald Trump, who has a polarizing relationship with Democrats, clearly fractured, but also attacks other Republicans who don't agree or embrace him. And again, I think also of policy issues like guns. You know, after Oklahoma City in '95, President Bush quit the NRA, quit his lifetime membership. After what happened in Parkland, Florida, you see President Trump not only say that we should arm teachers, but continue to do business with the NRA.
I'm not sure, Liz, that I would go along with the attack on President Trump, because frankly, not to say that he doesn't make mistakes and hasn't done some things wrong, but I think there's culpability on all sides here. And that's the question I have for you is the perception that Washington has become a zero-sum game where all sides, Democrats, Republicans, the White House, feel I only win if the other side loses. Is that fair? And is it fair to say that this polarization is preventing us from addressing our problems and dealing with it?
Well, I've really missed Juan. I forgot how much. But look, we are very polarized. I mean, one thing that's true, though, is that, I can speak for, on the floor of the House of Representatives, there isn't venom all the time. And I've found that you can go sit down next to anybody from any party. They've got an interesting story, and they're good people there for the right reasons. Now, it is the truth, however, that we have big issues. We have a lot of Democrats now coming in who are socialists. That's not I'm not exaggerating. They are socialists. And I think that it's very important that we actually do have very aggressive and clear policy debates. We got to make sure that we understand the grave national security threat that's out there, as well as the threat that we're facing from the perspective of our debt. And the socialist set of agendas, a set of issues, which I think Leader Pelosi is probably going to be compelled to have to push forward, are ones that would be disastrous for the nation. So I think we've got to fight and fight hard on those issues.
I think that Juan is going to say he missed you.
There's no question. We've known each other for quite a while.
Let's try to end this on a more personal note. Carl, when you and I, before the show began, you were saying that George H.W. Bush changed the arc of your life. I mean, what did this man mean to you?
Great, make me cry on national television. I went to work for him when I was in my early 20s, and the rest of my life is a result of being associated with him. And he taught me what it was like what the kind of person I had to strive to be. Anybody who was around George Bush came to love him and admire him, and to try and emulate him. He was a kind and gentle and decent person. He's also strong and principled, with great convictions and character. and integrity. And when you're around him, you wanted to emulate those things. You know, look at that incredible life that he had. And Jim Baker put his finger on a big part of it. The fearlessness of a kid who grows up in privilege in the East, and his father's a bigwig in a Wall Street firm, Brown Brothers Harriman, and he says, like so many Americans, I'm going to strike out for the West, and I'm going to learn the oil business from the bottom up, and I'm going to strike a new life. If you go to Midland, Texas, and see the modest house, it's not bigger than the stage that we're sitting on here that he lived in Midland. And he jumped into politics as a Republican when they hunted Republicans in Texas with dogs. And then he served our country so well in so many great positions. And he did so you talk to people who had a chance to work with him, whether it was at the CIA or in China or as vice president or wherever in the oil patch. And they admired him because he was not only a very great man, he was a very good man.
And let me just quickly, because we're running out of time. Liz, any personal remembrance of this man, any dealing that you had with him either directly or through your dad?
Well, I just remember election night in 2004 up in the residence of the White House when President Bush, 41, saw my daughter, Kate, and walked over to her and he said, "You're the youngest person here and I'm the oldest person and we need to sit together tonight." And he sat there, the two of them together in an armchair, deep in conversation.
And it must have meant a lot to him because that was the second term that he never got, but his son did get.
He was a great and good man. And as Carl said, somebody whom we should all strive to
Juan, 30 seconds.
Well, I traveled with him, especially in '94 for the Reagan re-election. And one of the things that struck me, Chris, was he wrote notes every day to lots of people, knew them as human beings, had a relationship. So he's asking you for something. It wasn't that it was the first call. He was asking because he knew you and you knew him. And I got to say, to reassert what Carl just said, one of the kindest, most loving people. Self-effacing.
Thank you, panel. And we'll see you all next week back in Washington. Up next, how visitors here at the Reagan Presidential Library are getting the chance to meet the 40th President Ronald Reagan face-to-face as Fox News Sunday continues from Simi Valley, California.